After the United Kingdom European Union membership referendum in June 2016, Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland, indicated that a second referendum on Scottish independence could be held. A referendum on Scottish independence was previously held in September 2014, when 55% voted against the proposal. One of the reasons cited by those opposed to Scottish independence was that it would endanger Scotland being part of the European Union. Following the Conservative victory in the May 2015 UK general election, a referendum on UK membership of the EU was organised. The Scottish National Party, which supports Scottish independence, stated in its manifesto for the May 2016 Scottish Parliament election that it would consider holding a second independence referendum if there was a material change of circumstances, such as the UK leaving the EU. The Leave side won the June 2016 referendum with 52% of the vote. In Scotland, 62% of votes were to remain in the EU, including a majority of voters in every local authority area. There has since been political debate and negotiation about whether there should be a second Scottish independence referendum, or if it is possible for Scotland to maintain links with the EU after the UK leaves. Background: Scottish independence referendum 2014. The 2014 referendum on Scottish independence saw Scotland vote to remain part of the United Kingdom, with 55% voting against the proposal for Scotland to become an independent country and 45% voting in favour. Uncertainty over Scotland's European Union membership was a topic in the run-up to the referendum vote. The British government and some mainstream political parties argued that remaining in the UK was the only way for Scotland to remain part of the EU. United Kingdom European Union membership referendum 2016. In a referendum held on the 23rd of June 2016, all 32 council areas in Scotland voted by a majority for the UK to remain a member of the EU. 62% of Scottish voters voted to remain a member of the EU, with 38% voting to leave. Overall, 52% of voters in the UK voted to leave the EU, with 48% voting to remain. Majorities in England and Wales were in favour of leaving the EU. In response to the result, on the 24th of June 2016, the Scottish Government said officials would begin planning for a second independence referendum. Scottish First Minister Nicola Sturgeon said it was clear that the people of Scotland see the future as part of the European Union, and that Scotland had spoken decisively with a strong, unequivocal vote to remain in the European Union. Sturgeon said it was democratically unacceptable that Scotland could be taken out of the EU against its will. Scotland's future relations with the EU following the referendum result. Sturgeon said she would communicate to all EU member states that Scotland had voted to stay in the EU. An emergency Scottish Cabinet meeting on the 25th of June agreed that the Scottish Government would seek to enter negotiations with the EU and its member states to explore options to protect Scotland's place in the EU. On the 28th of June, Sturgeon said that independence is not my starting point in these discussions. My starting point is to protect our relationship with the EU. After a summit of EU leaders on the 29th of June, Sturgeon held meetings with some EU officials. She raised the possibility of parts of the UK remaining within the EU, or for these areas to have special arrangements with the EU. After the UK leaves, David Edward, a former Justice of the European Court of Justice, suggested that these arrangements would relate to policy areas that have been devolved to Scotland. Sturgeon also met with European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker, who commented that, "I will listen carefully to what the First Minister will tell me, but we don't have the intention, neither Donald Tusk nor myself, to interfere in a British process that is not our duty and this is not our job. Manfred Weber, leader of the European People's Party group, and Guy Verhofstadt, leader of the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats for Europe group, indicated that they were supportive of Scotland remaining an EU member. Gunther Kirchbaum, head of the Bundestag's Committee for EU Affairs, made supportive comments about Scotland becoming a member state of the EU. Spanish Prime Minister Mariano Rajoy said, "Very clear, Scotland does not have the competence to negotiate with the European Union." He also stated his opposition to the EU negotiating with anyone other than the government of United Kingdom, and that, if the United Kingdom leaves, Scotland leaves. Similarly, the French President, François Hollande, stated, "The negotiations will be conducted with the United Kingdom, not with a part of the United Kingdom." The Scottish European and External Affairs Committee held an evidence session on the 30th of June, asking a panel of 4 experts what they felt was the best way to secure the Scottish-EU relationship. Hughes stated that the simplest and most obvious way would be to be an independent state and transition in and stay in the EU. Douglas Scott said that, legally there are precedents, but there were also political difficulties. Referring to Catalonia in Spain, Edward believed Scotland makes quite a good fit with Iceland and Norway, referring to the European Economic Area and a European Free Trade Association, while Scott hinted that Scotland could be a successor state, meaning the rest of the UK would leave but Scotland would retain its seat. The new UK Prime Minister Theresa May met with First Minister Sturgeon on the 15th of July in Edinburgh, when May stated that she was willing to listen to options for Scotland, although she later stated that some options were impracticable. Sturgeon then publicly stated that she had 5 tests for any future arrangements. The IPPR think tank stated that Scottish Unionists needed to provide options for Scotland if they wished to retain the British Union. The Scottish Labour Party published an action plan in July 2016, focusing on the economy. Legislative consent. The Scotland Act 1998 empowers the Scottish Parliament to legislate in policy areas devolved to Scotland, but one of its clauses obliges the Scottish Parliament to ensure its legislation is compatible with European law. For the UK to completely leave the EU, it would need to remove that obligation. If the UK Parliament wishes to legislate on policy areas devolved to Scotland, or if it wishes to amend the powers devolved to Scotland, by convention it needs the Scottish Parliament to pass a legislative consent motion. On the 26th of June 2016, Sturgeon said she would ask the Scottish Parliament to withhold consent if she thought it was not in Scotland's interests, giving evidence to a House of Lords committee before the EU referendum. David Edwards suggested the consent of the Scottish Parliament would be needed for this legislation. Media reports suggested this might give the Scottish Parliament a veto over UK withdrawal from the EU, but under the Scotland Act 1998 the UK Parliament could ultimately override the veto, as it is based only on parliamentary convention. Alternatively, the UK Parliament could choose to disregard the obligation for the Scottish Parliament to observe EU law. The Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Theresa Villiers, said that the UK government would consult with the devolved governments and noted that it was for the UK Parliament to decide whether to leave the EU by repealing the European Communities Act 1972. Political views on proposed Scottish referendum. Former First Minister Alex Salmond said the vote was a significant and material change in Scotland's position within the United Kingdom, and that he was certain the Scottish National Party would implement its manifesto on holding a second referendum. The outgoing British Prime Minister, David Cameron, stated that there was a legal, fair and decisive referendum 2 years ago. The the last thing Scotland needs now is another divisive referendum, and that the best possible deal for the United Kingdom will also be the best possible deal for Scotland. The leader of the Scottish Conservative Party, Ruth Davidson, expressed her opposition to a second Scottish referendum, saying that the country needed stability. Davidson later said that although she was opposed to a second referendum, she thought that the UK government should not prevent it from happening. Scottish Labour leader Kezia Dugdale said in July 2016 that it would be categorically wrong for the UK government to block a second independence referendum. Her preference is for Scotland to remain in both the UK and the EU, under a proposal for the UK to adopt a more federal procedure. Following the EU referendum, Nicola Sturgeon stated that the Scottish Government, the devolved executive of Scotland, had agreed to draft legislation to allow a second independence referendum to take place, as the Constitution is a reserved matter under the Scotland Act 1998, for a future referendum on Scottish independence to be binding under UK law. It would need to receive the consent of the British Parliament to take place. It has been suggested, however, that the Scottish Parliament could approve a consultative referendum on the subject of independence, which would enable the referendum taking place without the approval of the British Parliament. The referendum would not be legally binding under UK law in this case. Scottish Secretary David Mundell stated on the 26th of June 2016 that, if the people of Scotland ultimately determine that they want to have another referendum, there will be one, and added, could there be another referendum? The answer to that question is yes. Should there be another referendum? I believe the answer to that question is no. Opinion polling. In nearly every opinion poll, participants are asked to respond to the question, should Scotland be an independent country? The 2014 referendum question. A response of yes, therefore, is for Scottish independence, and a response of no, for remaining in the United Kingdom. Following EU membership referendum, only polling companies that are members of the British Polling Council, and therefore fully disclose the findings and methodology, are shown in this section. Polls by other organizations. Some opinion polls were conducted by organizations that were not members of the British Polling Council and therefore not obliged to fully disclose the findings and methodology. The table below denotes opinion polling conducted by said organizations. Polls conducted before the EU referendum. Before the United Kingdom European Union membership referendum 2016, there were some opinion polls conducted which asked people if they would vote for Scottish independence in the event of a leave vote in that referendum. Opinion polling in England and Wales. In 2014, a plurality of people polled in England and Wales thought that Scotland would vote to remain in the United Kingdom. However, an opinion poll carried out 28 to 30 June 2016 showed a marked change, with 69% believing that Scotland would vote for independence in a second referendum, with 16% believing it would vote against independence. Opinion polling in the European Union. Polls conducted by YouGov in July 2016 found majority support in Germany, Denmark, Finland, Sweden and France for Scotland becoming an EU member, should it become an independent state.